Chapter 1. The Invitation in the Dark. It had been 3 days since Elijah received the letter. The envelope was thick, made of coarse paper, and sealed with a scarlet wax emblem, an image of a twisted tree, its roots curling into a grotesque shape. The handwriting on the front was elegant, almost too perfect. Elijah North, asterisk, it began in flowing script, asterisk, you are cordially invited to the gathering at Ashen Hill House. Come alone. The doors will open at midnight. Elijah didn't recognize the name. Asterisk Ashen Hill House. Asterisk, it sounded like something pulled from the pages of a forgotten myth. A place buried deep in the history of a town he'd never visited. Despite the chilling nature of the letter, something about it called to him, gnawing at the edges of his curiosity. Elijah had spent years investigating the paranormal, chasing whispers of ghosts and hauntings that most people would dismiss as fiction. Yet, this felt different. There was an urgency in the letter that hinted at something far darker. Perhaps it was his own loneliness, the feeling of being drawn into the unknown, that pushed him to respond. The letter had no return address, no sender, but it didn't need one. His mind wrestled with the idea. Was this a trap or an opportunity he couldn't let slip away? On the night of the invitation, as the moon hung high in the sky, Elijah found himself standing at the edge of a desolate hill, gazing up at the towering silhouette of Ashen Hill House. It loomed above him like a dark, watchful sentinel. Its windows were hollow eyes, staring back at him from the edge of the cliff, where the wind howled through the twisted trees. The mansion appeared abandoned, the walls cracked and weathered by time. Vines twisted around its decaying stone, choking the life out of the structure. The door, a warped and rusted thing, stood ajar. He stepped forward, his heartbeat quickening as he crossed the threshold. The air inside was thick with dust, heavy with the scent of something long forgotten. The door creaked shut behind him with a finality that sent a shiver down his spine. "Come in, Elijah," a voice whispered from the shadows. The words weren't spoken aloud, but reverberated in his mind, like a distant murmur carried on the wind. The voice felt ancient, as though it had been waiting for him for a long time. He had no choice but to follow it, deeper into the house. Chapter 2. The Room of Forgotten Faces. Elijah's footsteps echoed through the vast, empty halls. The house seemed abandoned, yet there was something undeniably alive about it. Something that watched him from the corners, from the creaking floorboards beneath his feet. The walls were lined with portraits, their frames ornate and covered in layers of dust. But the faces, they were the most unsettling part. They were not simply painted. They were eyes that watched him, their gazes locked onto his every movement, each one a silent observer, a silent judgment. The faces were familiar, though he couldn't place them. Their features were sharply defined, their eyes too wide, too knowing. Some were smiling, others were stern, but all of them were impossibly lifelike, their expression so vivid it felt as if they could speak. Elijah's eyes moved over the paintings until one in particular made him freeze. It was a woman, a pale, hauntingly beautiful woman, her face serene but distant. Her eyes, however, were unmistakable. He knew them. "Grandmother," he whispered. The woman in the portrait looked exactly like his grandmother, Eliza North, who had died years ago. His breath caught in his throat, the room spinning around him. This couldn't be. She had never mentioned this house. She had never spoken of Ashen Hill. The whispers started again, softer this time, but they were undeniable. They were coming from the portraits, no longer merely on the edges of his hearing, but inside his mind, urging him forward. "Look closer." He approached the portrait, his pulse quickening. The woman's eyes shifted, locking with his, and for a moment, he thought he saw her lips curl into the faintest smile. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice faint and far away. "You've finally come." He stepped back, the room suddenly spinning. His mind reeled. Was this real? Had his grandmother somehow left a message for him in this house, from beyond the grave? The house seemed to pulse with life, its shadows darkening as the lanterns flickered. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest as the temperature in the room dropped, and the soft voice from the portrait urged him forward. Do not turn back. There is no escape now. Chapter 3. The Descent into Madness. Elijah tried to steady himself, but the house seemed to be closing in on him. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if the very walls of Ashen Hill were alive, speaking to him, feeding on his fear. His legs moved of their own accord, taking him down a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. At the end of the hallway, there was a door heavy and imposing. It creaked open as if expecting him. The air that wafted from the room beyond was thick with the stench of rot and decay. And then there was the sound, the scraping, dragging sound of something heavy moving across stone. His pulse quickened as he stepped inside. The room was a dimly lit chamber, its floor covered in dust and debris. The walls were lined with shelves, old and worn, their contents covered in cobwebs. But it wasn't the books or the forgotten relics that drew Elijah's gaze. It was the figure in the far corner. A man. No, not a man. Something far worse. His skin was drawn tight over the bones, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed. The man's clothes were ragged, his posture unnatural. He was motionless at first, but then slowly, deliberately, his head turned toward Elijah. The hollow eyes seemed to pierce through him. "Welcome," the figure rasped, his voice wet and sickly. "I am the keeper of Ashen Hill. You are the last." Elijah stumbled back, but his legs betrayed him. He collapsed to the ground, his breath shallow. The figure's mouth twisted into a grin, sharp and terrible, as his body began to shimmer and flicker like a candle in the wind. It was then that Elijah realized this was not a man at all. The keeper was an illusion, a trap to lure him deeper into the house. "Come closer," the keeper crooned, his voice turning into a low growl. "The house has claimed you now. The gathering begins." The walls of Ashen Hill shifted around him, closing in like a giant, hungry mouth. Shadows stretched, reaching for him, pulling him toward the center of the room where the keeper stood waiting. Chapter 4. The House That Devours Souls. Elijah fought the pull, but the house was stronger. The shadows seemed to bleed into his very soul, clawing at him, pulling him apart. His hands shook as he tried to break free, but it was no use. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of tormented souls, their voices overlapping and shrieking in his mind. He was being consumed by the house, by something ancient and evil, something that had been waiting for him, for his blood, for his fear. The keeper's laughter filled the room, a sound so hollow it made Elijah's skin crawl. "You were always meant to come," it said, the voice now surrounding him, wrapping around his mind like a vice. "The house does not let go. You will be trapped here, like all those before you. There is no escape." The air became thick with a darkness that pressed in from all sides. Elijah felt his body weakening, his will slipping away. The house was feeding on him, on his fear, his panic, his very essence. The figure of the keeper morphed, becoming 1,000 faces, all the souls that had been consumed by the house, all the guests who had been lured here by the same invitation. Suddenly, Elijah felt himself falling, not just through the room, but through the very foundation of Ashen Hill itself. The walls twisted, the floor cracked open, and he fell into a void of endless blackness, his mind dissolving into the darkness. Chapter 5. The Last Invitation. When the sun rose, the town below Ashen Hill was quiet, untouched. No one had seen or heard from Elijah North again, but the house remained, perched atop the hill like a monument to its own darkness. Days passed. The town went on with its daily life, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded within Ashen Hill's decaying walls. But one morning, a letter appeared at the doorstep of a nearby home, sealed with the same scarlet wax. "Elijah North has joined the gathering. You are invited. Come alone." The invitation was once again sent, but this time, it wasn't Elijah who would be called. The house on Ashen Hill was never truly finished with its guests. It had a new mark, a new soul to claim, and it was already preparing for its next visitor.